Okay, welcome to the regular meeting of the Planning Commission on Tuesday, August 13, 2024. This meeting is called to order. Margaret, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Brevetali.
Here.
Commissioner Rutby.
Here.
Commissioner Thade.
Here.
Chair Haveman.
Here.
Commissioner Mercado is an excused absence this evening. You have a quorum, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Now to the order of the agenda. Are there any commissioners that would like to request changes to the order of the agenda? Nope. Okay. Next, we'll move to the meeting procedures. The City of San Rafael remains committed for all to participate in our public meetings. I want to welcome all that are making the time this evening to participate. Each member of the public may provide 3 minutes for comment. This will ensure we have the opportunity to hear from everyone. Margaret, would you please tell us how public comment will work this evening?
Thank you, Chair Haveman. This meeting is being recorded, excuse me, and streamed live to YouTube through Zoom. Viewers can watch directly through Zoom using the link on the agenda or by dialing 669-444-9171 and then entering the meeting ID 840-9897-7308#. In order to provide testimony, oral testimony, however, speakers must be present in the chambers. Displayed in the podium is a timer that will help you stay within your allotted time frame. You are invited, though not required, to introduce yourself and say what part of San Rafael you reside in, or if you reside outside of San Rafael.
Next on the agenda is oral communication for the public. Remarks on non-agenda items are welcome at this time and may be on anything within the subject matter jurisdiction of the Planning Commission. Remarks on agenda items will be heard at the time the item is discussed. Is there anyone present who wishes to speak on items not on the agenda? I see there is no one present. Okay, then we'll move on to the consent calendar. On the consent calendar this evening, we have 2 sets of draft minutes for consideration. The first is the draft Planning Commission minutes of February 27, 2024, and Rules and Procedures 2024.
Through the chair, I did want to add a note regarding the February minutes. That's the one where you was your annual meeting of the Planning Commission and we updated the rules and procedures. I want to note that I incorporated all the changes into that document as requested by the Planning Commission, except one, which is found on page 2. It's B1A. Since the number of planning commissioners is expanding, it seemed best to hold this request and bring it back once the new commissioners are seated. And that way you would reflect the rotation of the number of commissioners that you would have present in order to rotate the chair and vice chair appropriately. Except for that, and I annotated that in the rules and procedures so that people could track it if they were following along. But I just wanted to note that the rest of those were incorporated and those were included in your draft minutes in the packet.
Thank you, Margaret. Are there any questions or comments on the draft minutes from February 27, 2024? Okay, seeing none, do I have a motion?
I make a motion, Commissioner Rodby, to approve both of the minutes.
Second?
This is Commissioner Brevetali. I second the motion.
Margaret, would you please call the roll?
Certainly. Commissioner Brevetali.
Yes.
Commissioner Rodby.
Yes.
Commissioner Sade.
Yes.
Chair Haveman.
Yes.
Motion is approved unanimously with an absence on Commissioner Mercado.
Okay, I suppose I could have done these simultaneously. The next step is the draft Planning Commission minutes of March 12, 2024. And Margaret, was there more that you wanted to explain about your notes on the February minutes, or is that?
Nope, no, that was just the,
Okay.
yeah, sorry.
Okay, and the motion was just on the February minutes, right?
I believe.
It was both? It was both?
Yeah, through
Okay.
the chair, I believe Commissioner Rodby got both.
All right, I'll try to pay better attention. All right, so then we'll move on to tonight's action item. We have one action item this evening, and this is this evening the Planning Commission will receive a presentation on state housing laws. Margaret, will you please introduce the presenter this evening?
Certainly, Chair Haveman. Tonight we will be joined by Connor T. McLean. He's an associate with Burke, Williams, and Sorensen. He's going to be joining us via Zoom, and you can see him up on the screen this evening. I want to note that he will be happy to answer clarifying questions on topics that he presents this evening, but he can't answer any hypothetical legal questions or specific questions about any project that may have come before the commission or may in the future come before the commission. With that said, Connor, please begin your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me tonight. Are you able to see on the screen, is the presentation big enough? I know I've been before at remote conferences where the presenter's face is like too big to see the presentation very well. And I like my haircut, but I would rather you see the presentation.
I think your face is just the right size. Thank you.
All right, great. So I thank you, Margaret, for introducing me and for setting this up. I'm Connor McLean. I'm an associate at Burke Williams & Sorensen. I work closely with Neera Doherty, who I suspect you all know, on land use matters in San Rafael and other cities. I think I met you all in person maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago, when we were working together on something. But anyways, the purpose of today's presentation is to provide all of you with a bit of information about common housing laws that you might come across as you consider development applications in San Rafael. And I don't expect that you're going to remember everything that I covered tonight. I'm not going to try and give you a comprehensive picture of every housing law out there because there are a lot and they're changing all the time. But I just want you to be familiar with some laws that you might come across so that if you get some projects in front of you, you're not shocked that some laws exist because housing law has changed a lot in the last 7 years and continues to change a lot. And planning commissions don't have the same types of discretion that they once had on certain housing development projects. So we're going to cover that. Margaret, can you go to the next slide? So tonight we're going to cover, oh, I still see the first slide.
Yes, 1 second.
Oh, yeah. Perfect, thank you. So we'll cover 3 sort of broad topics: housing law fundamentals, utilizing commercially zoned land for residential development, and then just kind of some other miscellaneous housing laws. We're going to spend most of the time in topic 1, housing law fundamentals. Next slide, please. And within that category, we'll cover state density bonus law, the Housing Accountability Act, and the Housing Crisis Act, which is SB 330. The name of it is the Housing Crisis Act. All right, next slide, please. So let's start with the state density bonus law, a little overview. So the state density bonus law allows developers who provide certain public benefits to exceed the density that would normally be allowed on a certain piece of land. So let's say that normally you would only be allowed to develop 10 units on a piece of land. If you provide certain things, you might be allowed to develop 15 units on that piece of land. So you have to give certain things to get the bonuses. This applies to developments of at least 5 units. You have to give either affordable housing, and there's different affordability levels that we'll get into on another slide in a minute. The project could be 100% senior housing. Sometimes a developer could donate land to the city or a county for affordable housing. So instead of actually providing affordable units in their development, they would develop a 100% market rate development, and then they would donate land to the city off-site that the city could then use to develop affordable housing at a future date. That's less common. I haven't really seen that one used that often, but good to know that it exists. Condo conversions, where some of the converted units are affordable, qualify. Developments with childcare facilities or student housing and shared housing buildings also qualify. And then the things that you get for providing those things are you get bonus units. So like I said, whereas normally, maybe the maximum amount of units allowed on a lot would be 10, with certain bonuses that you would qualify for at different levels, you might get a, 20% bonus, a 30% bonus, a 40% bonus. The maximum bonus just under the state density bonus law is 50%. There's other laws that I'm not going to get into now that can add on top of that. So you could get up to 100%, but I won't go into that tonight. That's kind of more nuanced. You also can get reduced parking standards. You can get incentives and concessions. I'll talk about those in a minute. Waivers of development standards. And then there's also a commercial density bonus that I'm not going to get into tonight because you probably won't see that often. All right, next slide, please.
Well, a quick question on the previous slide.
Mhm.
So if you give one of those things, you get all of those things?
If you give one of those things, you get the bonus units, you get the reduced parking standards, you get some incentives and concessions depending on how much you're giving. So let's say you're giving, only 20% of your units are affordable to low income households. You might get only one incentive and concession. But let's say that 50% of your units are going to be affordable to low income households, then you would get more incentives and concessions. You get unlimited waivers, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. And then the commercial density bonus, again, that's for commercial projects. I'm not going to get into that. It's
Right.
for housing projects and then that are mixed use, but I won't go into that tonight.
Okay, so the answer is pretty much?
Pretty much all of them, yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I have one more question on this slide as well.
Yeah.
Regarding the land for affordable housing, does that
Mhm.
have to be within the same city? Within the city?
I believe that it does, but I can check on that. If you want to email Margaret that question, I can look into that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So we are right. The state density bonus law removes some of the planning commission's discretion that it would have had the state density bonus law not existed. So areas in which the local agency, so here the city, doesn't have much discretion is whether to say yes or no to the density bonus, and whether to say yes or no to the parking reductions. This is pretty. There's literally a table in the law, and I have like a little snip of part of the table, but basically if you provide this number of affordable units, then you get this percent of a density bonus. When you calculate that based on the allowable density, that comes up to this many units. The city can't say, no, you don't get that. The answer is the state density bonus law. A developer qualifies for that bonus under the state density bonus law. And so the city has to allow that number of units. Same with parking reductions. I'm not going to get into the specifics of parking reductions. The calculation is also very formulaic. I don't think it's particularly interesting, but project to project wide basis, it's just helpful to know that parking reductions exist. The areas where the city still has some discretion are on incentives and concessions, and on waivers. And I'll get into those in just a second.
I have a question on this slide, Connor. Do you mind or should I wait? Okay.
No, yeah.
So we've had projects with the density bonus, and I guess I have a hard time understanding the objectiveness of density, because I know that the developer basically says, this is how many units I can fit on the site if I meet all of the laws. But there's so many different ways of configuring a lot that it seems like that is very malleable, I guess.
So Connor, let me start and then I'll lean back over to you. So there's in Connor's slides, he's going to touch on this a little bit. Sad when I go to speak and then a mute planner is ironic, and I appreciate the smiles. In the downtown precise plan, we do not have a density. So that's when we run into that conversation of make your base project. And that's what you're talking about, I believe, where they're like, so how that is operated is it is malleable to a certain extent. So absolutely true. Every development team that you see come before you has an idea of about what unit size they want to sell, right? That's based on, they have their own economics, their own market data, whether it's senior housing or it's 2-bedroom, 1-bedroom type, they have a model. So they'll come forward with their project with the average unit sizes in it based on their performance and their understanding. That's the they create the base project based on those average size units. And then we talk about the parameters that are identified through the downtown precise plan, and we basically draw a box. So that's how that math occurs. Outside of the downtown precise plan, there is density noted in our documents. So now they have to talk about the maximum unit density allowed in that area, and then talk about how that base project comes out of there. So it's much less malleable. They still have a focus on the project they'd like to build and the unit size they'd like to build that they believe will work for our location. But with a density identified, it's a little bit less malleable. Connor, did I miss anything?
That's pretty much it. And I'm going to go into it a bit more on some future slides. Why don't we, if you're still confused on it, when I do the slide on objective standards and when I do the slide on how to calculate base density, after those two slides, why don't we chat about it if you're still confused?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think there's just
Okay.
a clarifying question that's how I understand it. I guess we'll see after the slide. So,
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Great question.
Yeah.
All right. So, calculating base density, this is really relevant to the question you just asked. So, base density is the maximum allowable residential density on a site allowed, by the code. So, a lot of times that is really a really clearly objective standard. It's expressed in dwelling units per acre. So you would say, in this zone, the maximum allowable density on a unit is 10 dwelling units per acre. So if you had a 1 acre site, you would multiply your 1 acre by the 10 dwelling units per acre, and your base density would be that there were 10 units allowable on that site. If density is not expressed, and so that is where the base density is a really clear-cut objective standard. Most of San Rafael has a zoning designation that has a dwelling units per acre density standard, which is just like really clear-cut. The downtown precise plan expresses density, doesn't have a specific density expressed in dwelling units per acre. And in that case, because it's a form-based code, which basically means the building can be X amount of feet high, there have to be these setbacks, etc. Like Margaret was saying, an applicant would just provide an estimate of the development capacity based on the maximum units that they could fit within the building that they're allowed to build, and then they would calculate their density bonus on top of that. One sort of caveat here is, I think that Margaret explained that oftentimes an applicant will provide an estimate of the realistic development capacity based on their proposed unit size. And that generally doesn't end up getting you the maximum base density that could be allowed. Technically, I think that an applicant could come and say, I want to build the maximum size building that I can build here. And I want to put the most units that I could possibly put in here by building the minimum legally allowed unit size under the building code. And that is how you would really calculate the absolute maximum base density. Most people aren't doing that because they want to provide units that are bigger than the minimum, and then they just calculate their density bonus on top of that. But so that's how that would work. Does that kind of clarify?
Yeah, it does. I understand that. I guess my question really is about other program areas. So, like for instance, 1515 4th Street that we saw, there is like back of house space, and there's like a community space, and there's all these other spaces. So if the developer adds those in, like say they say, okay, based on the code, we can fit 50 units here. But the project that I want, it includes all this extra program area, and I get 70 units. So then the building automatically, doesn't that get higher or wider? Or it gets higher because you're then adding on additional program area outside of actual units.
So I just want to jump in. One of the ways that I was able to encourage Connor to do a presentation this evening is I promised him we wouldn't talk about projects that have come before the city or might come before the city.
Okay.
However, I'm very.
Okay, I forgot that you said not hypothetical.
Yeah.
Any project that comes in may have additional program area outside of units. And I think that's where I don't understand the law.
So why don't we set up a meeting where we can sit down and talk about that so that we can go through all the details of that. And every project is going to have some kind of amenity space or back of house space. So just so we don't muddy the waters tonight, we have to step back, but I'm happy to meet with you and go over those details.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think this is a really project specific question. And so I don't really think I can answer the question without sitting down and looking at a development application.
Just
So,
a couple
yeah.
more, just a couple of questions, not about the project, but
Yeah.
just about what you're talking about. You mentioned that there's a minimum size per unit per building code. Is that correct? And if so, could you elaborate on that? Do you have a sense of approximately what the minimum size is?
I'm not sure exactly what the minimum size is. I've talked with Don about it before when we've talked about kind of the building code. I just know that the state building code said, you're not allowed to have like a legal bedroom can't be 10 square feet. And a legal kitchen has to be, it has to have a stove and it has to have this.
Okay.
So I don't remember, and a legal bathroom has to be a certain size. I don't know the exact size, but like if the smallest, if you wanted to cram the most units in one building, you would do efficiency units, which is like it's kind of like a studio. And there is a minimum size. I'm not sure what it is.
Okay. So, but it's based on some sort of realistic, objective or whatnot of a person.
Yeah. There is an object. There is.
Like
It's not in land use law. It's in the building code. But those two things kind of interact in this way where the minimum unit size is determined by the building code, and then you use the minimum unit size to determine the density.
Okay. And then my other question, which is related, is I know I think you mentioned, or maybe Margaret mentioned, that we don't have a maximum allowable density for the downtown precise plan. Is it allowed? Is this question allowed if it's about the precise plan?
Yes, you can definitely ask about generally speaking, how the precise plan addresses this. Yes.
Okay. And yeah, that's my understanding. And I was just wondering, how common is that to not have a maximum density?
So again, and Connor, you're welcome to so in the cities I have worked in or as a consultant written documents for, form-based codes oftentimes don't have a maximum density.
Okay.
There are some form-based codes that are hybrid enough that they do put a maximum density on, but the premise of a form-based code is to not focus on that, but to focus on how the buildings feel, the massing, the step back, the setback, the public realm, and it's kind of typically the folks that write those kind of codes consider that like something in play. And again, to Connor's point, somebody could come in with a minimum size micro unit available to the building code, but they wouldn't rent them or they wouldn't sell them, right? You start thinking of Hong Kong or Manhattan or those examples that wouldn't necessarily work where we currently are sitting. So that's the danger, is somebody games that unit size, but we haven't seen that. And I haven't seen that the only city I've seen that in was in Berkeley because of the college proximity. They were able to rent micro units, and it was a whole lot of discussion about that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think that in the history of zoning codes, in the last kind of 50-ish years, form-based codes have really not been the standard. They've not been what people use. but in the or what cities use, I mean, but in the last 5 to 10 years or so, and definitely moving forward, I think that form-based codes are sort of seen by planners often and by sort of forward-thinking policy people. They really love form-based codes, and it's kind of like the hot new thing in planning. So, right. And I think that contributes to part of the reason that San Rafael's, more recent downtown precise plan uses a form-based code. And I think Richmond, the city, might recently have adopted a form-based code in the entire city. Or they're in the process of doing so. And I know that some other cities are doing that as well, but it certainly has been a rarity that is increasingly more common in recent years, and I suspect will become more common in the years to come.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. So this chart is like a snippet from the chart that's just in the law that talks about, it kind of goes back to the, you have to give something to get something. So, for example, if you give 5% of the units in your development are deed restricted to be affordable for very low income households, then you get a 20% density bonus. And for every additional 1% of the units that you provide as deed restricted units, so let's say you provided 6% units, then you would get an extra 2.5% density bonus. So you'd get 22.5, et cetera, et cetera. Going all the way up to the maximum density bonus of 50% if you provide 15% of your units affordable to very low income households. Same thing, lower income, the minimum percent is 10%. You get at 10% of the units, you get a bonus of 20%, 1.5 extra percent bonus for every percent increase, up to if you provide 24% of the units to lower income households, you get 50%. And there's also a moderate income density bonus that starts at 10% and goes all the way up to 44%.
Connor, can you explain those? Like if you have some very low, some lower, can you explain how that works?
Good question. I think that this has to do with there's like a recent change to the state density bonus law, but earlier I mentioned there's like a way that you can kind of stack them on top of each other. I think that that's how that works, but I'm not super familiar with, I haven't worked on projects that do that. So again, email Margaret. It's a great question and I would love to answer it, but email Margaret and I will email an answer to that question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, next slide, please. So, okay, like I said before, you give the stuff that I just talked about on the last slide, and you get some density bonus, and you also get incentives and concessions and waivers. One thing that I think is really annoying is that incentives and concessions mean the same thing. I don't know why they used two words to describe it, but they did. But they're the same thing, so you can use either word. You're entitled to up to 4 incentives based on the different levels of affordability. There's another chart for that. We don't need to go into it, but just know that you get at least 1 and up to a maximum of 4. The way that incentives and concessions work is that you get a reduction in the site development standards or modifications of the zoning requirements. So examples of reduction in site development standards would be, let's say that there was a height limit of 35 feet. The incentive that you request could be, I don't want you to enforce the height limit. So you would get to build above the height limit. And let's say you only qualified for 1 incentive and you chose that one, then that would be your one. But so you couldn't say, hey, I would like to not abide by the height limit and the setback distance if you only had 1 incentive that you qualified for. If you qualified for 2, you could request both of those. But and then an example of an incentive that relates to zoning codes is you could, in certain cases, you could provide housing in a commercial area if it would be compatible with the surrounding area. And there's some other ones too, but those are kind of just easiest examples. The kind of caveat here to the incentives and concessions is that the developer has to show that that granting the incentive or concession would result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide for affordable housing costs. So you can't just say, oh, I really want the market rate units in my development to be extra luxury. And so I would like to have really high ceilings in them. And so I want a waiver of the height limit. You have to show, the developer wouldn't be able to show that actually makes the housing more affordable. But if you can show, normally I wouldn't be able to, if I'm allowed to develop above the height that I normally would be allowed to develop at, it will make me be able to provide more units, which will make me be able to provide more affordable units. Then you could qualify for a height reduction as your incentive or concession. The other thing I want to note here is that if an applicant qualifies for an incentive and can show that that specific incentive would result in the identifiable and actual cost reductions, the city has to grant that incentive. So the city can't say, I get that you want a height increase, but we're not going to give that to you. But instead, we'll give you a setback concession. The city can't do that. If the applicant qualifies for the requested incentive or concession, then they need to give it. But there is some flexibility in terms, again, because they have to demonstrate that there's a cost reduction. There's some flexibility there. And then a waiver, this always confuses me. And I'm always like, what? It seems like it should be the same thing. A waiver means that an agency can't apply development standards that would physically preclude the construction of the project with the density bonus or incentives. And a developer gets unlimited waivers and no economic justifications required. A waiver, I think it's easiest to understand with an example. Imagine that there's a project on a site that would only be allowed regularly to develop 10 units, and it qualifies for a 50% density bonus. So that 15 units would be allowed on the site. And let's also say that the project qualifies for at least 2 incentives, and they ask for a concession on height and a concession on stepbacks. But in order to build the proposed project with the 15 units and the 2 incentives that they qualify for, the development would also necessarily violate a development standard that limits lot area coverage. So, if you have the whole lot, that's sort of the footprint of the building. The city has to waive the lot area coverage standard because applying it would physically preclude construction of the project with the density bonus and the incentives. So, and you get unlimited waivers. So waivers are not something that you have to bring it up. You have to say, I recognize that the development would violate this development standard, but you don't have to prove it or qualify for it. As long as you qualify for a density bonus, then you got unlimited waivers. I know that that's kind of confusing. Are there any questions on that?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So it's about the identifiable and actual cost reductions.
Mm-hmm.
How are cities typically performing due diligence to validate those claims?
I think oftentimes the developer just kind of puts forth their, here's how much it would cost us to build this one thing. Here would be our profits. If we did it without these incentives and concessions, and here is our projected costs and our profits with the incentives and concessions. And then, as long as it's not just some random guy on the street who did the math for that, it's someone who has, some sort of experience in that area, the city says, okay, that is sufficient evidence.
So there's no use of a non-biased third party, like an appraiser? Estimator?
I haven't seen that used, but I don't know if it could not be used. I can ask around, and get back to you on that question.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions on incentives, concessions, and waivers? No. All right. Great. Next slide, please, Margaret. So let's do an example. Imagine that there's a site where, and the zoning code says that the permissible density is 21.8 to 43.6 dwelling units per acre, with the maximum non-residential floor area ratio of 0.4. That's not really relevant to residential development, but anyways, and the site is 2.12 acres. So to calculate the base density, you would multiply the maximum allowable density, which here it's a range, so it's 43.6 dwelling units per acre, and multiply by the site area of 2.12 acres, you get 92.43 units. The law says that you have to round up. So the base density is 43 units on the site. To calculate the minimum number of units required that the developer has to give in order to get a bonus, you look at the chart and you see what percent is required. So let's say that the developer is going for 5% of the units to be very low income to qualify for a 20% density bonus. So they would multiply the whole number, 93 units, by 0.05 and then round up to the nearest whole number. And that's the number of units within the development that have to be the affordable units. And then the total number of units with the density bonus, you multiply so you get a 20% bonus for that. So you would multiply the 93 units by 1.2 and then round up to the nearest whole number. So, and this is on the next slide. There's math here. So let's go to the next slide. So here you can see, let's say that the developer was going to provide very low income units. The base density, like I said, is 93 units. 5% of base density would be 5% of 93, which is 4.65. You round up, and that's 5 units. So the developer has to provide 5 of the 93 units as deed restricted to very low income households. They're eligible for a 20% density bonus, which is 93 times 1.2 equals 111.6, and then you round up to 112 units. And then same for the other rows of this table. All right, next slide, please. There's another law. I'm not going to go super specific into this, but it's just good to know that it exists. It's AB 2334 from Buffy Wicks that allows a housing development project in certain counties to get added height and unlimited density if it's located in an area that is an urbanized, very low vehicle travel area. And there's like charts and there's definitions on what that means. In those areas, to qualify for this added height and unlimited density, you have to provide at least 80% of units restricted to lower income households, and no more than 20% can be for moderate income households. So Miranda is one of the counties that qualifies. Honestly, I have never seen this used. I don't think it's super commonly used. I think that oftentimes the market won't support. It's just not profitable to develop a project that is 80% affordable. But it's good to know that it exists. And there are affordable housing developer nonprofits that do develop affordable housing at those levels. So, you may see it, and, just don't be surprised if you come across it.
Could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What is there a definition for urbanized? I understand the concept of very low vehicle travel.
Yeah, there is. There's a definition of like what is an urbanized area.
At a high level, what does it mean? Why is
I often find myself chuckling a little bit at what urbanized is, because some of what qualifies as urbanized, I would maybe call rural or like very suburban.
Okay. So suburban as opposed to.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we're done with housing or state density bonus law stuff. We're going to get into Housing Accountability Act stuff. So just kind of a quick overview. Housing Accountability Act, it's a hot topic these days. It's often used. It was actually passed in 1982. The state legislature then recognized that there was a lack of housing, including emergency shelter, and that was a critical statewide problem. I don't think that the HAA was used a ton between, in the 80s, the 90s, early 2000s, even the 2010s. But in 2017, there was big reform to the Housing Accountability Act, and it's really kind of gotten a new lease on life. The Housing Accountability Act, it limits local government's ability to restrict the development of new housing. And this is often where planning commissions find themselves saying, wait, we thought that we were able to do, condition this project in this way, and we thought that we were going to be able to disapprove it and this and that and that. We thought we had more control. But the 2017 amendments to the Housing Accountability Act really strengthened state power and remove some local power from planning commissions to impose conditions on projects. So the kind of language of the law is a local agency may not reject or make infeasible housing developments without making certain findings. And there's a whole list of findings. Next slide, please. So the Housing Accountability Act applies to all housing development projects and emergency shelters. And then a housing development project is defined as either a project that's 100% residential, transitional and supportive housing, and then also mixed use projects with at least 2/3 of the square footage designated for residential use. I think it's kind of funny and duplicative to have the definition say both 100% residential and at least 2/3 residential, because the former is included in the latter. But anyways, keep in mind, it's really, if at least 2/3 of the square footage of a project are designated for residential use, then it is a housing development project, and the HAA applies. And the HAA critically applies to not just affordable housing, but also market rate housing. So, with state density bonus law, there's always an affordable component to the project. So you're always going to be talking about some level of affordability. With the HAA, you don't need to be building affordable housing for the Housing Accountability Act to apply. As long as you're building any housing development project, the HAA applies. All right, next slide, please. So one really, really critical part of the HAA is that if a housing development project complies with objective standards, the city can only reduce the density or deny the project if it makes certain findings. And those findings are that there is a specific adverse impact to public health and safety, and that the impact can't be mitigated in any other way. The bar for showing a specific adverse impact to public health and safety is really, really high. I have never worked with a city who has even attempted to make that finding to deny a project, because courts are generally find that the city's findings are inadequate. I'm not saying that there's never a case where that finding could be made, but I don't know of any examples of that finding being successful. And then there's more protections in the HAA for projects that are at least 20% affordable. So again, the HAA applies to all housing development projects, even if they're 100% market rate, but there are additional special protections for 20% affordable projects. All right, next slide, please. So the definition of an objective standard is that it involves no personal subjective judgment by a public official, and it is uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark or criterion available and knowable by both the development applicant or proponent and the public official. So really what this means is buildings cannot exceed 35 feet in height. You can take out measuring tape and it'll show you what 35 feet is, and the developer knows what 35 feet is, and the planning commission knows what 35 feet is, and there's no argument over what 35 feet is. Everyone knows objectively what 35 feet is. Same with density cannot exceed 10 dwelling units per acre. You have an acre and 10 dwelling units can go on it. Everyone knows what it is. It's agreed. Like, there's no question about what that means. Next slide, please. In contrast, a subjective standard is a standard that's not objective. So some examples, and I think that historically, particularly prior to 2017, a lot of development codes and zoning codes had a lot of subjective standards in them. So some examples are special care shall be taken to avoid obstructing views, or produce high quality, authentic design, or reflect the look and feel of the community. Or one that I see all the time is be harmonious with the surrounding neighborhood. You can't, no one, it requires, different people have different opinions about what that means. So, the developer might say, I think that this reflects the look and feel of the community, but a planning commissioner might say, well, I don't think it reflects it at all. And if it can't be known, then it's a subjective standard. So again, the Housing Accountability Act really says that a project can't be denied or have the density reduced for non-compliance with subjective standards. So, we have been encouraging a lot of cities, if you really are adamant that you want a certain standard applied to projects, you should rewrite the standard to be objective. There's a case, it's called, I have no idea how to pronounce it, although I write it all the time, Honcharu something, I don't know. Basically, the case says there was a standard that said the site is not physically suitable for the proposed development. Again, that's a subjective standard. All right, next slide. So one feature of the HAA is that a project must be deemed consistent with objective standards if substantial evidence would allow a reasonable person to conclude that the development is consistent with the objective standard. Substantial evidence here is a term of art. It does not mean that there's a lot of evidence. It means that the evidence actually exists. It just means that the evidence has substance. It's not just someone's conjecture. Like, actual evidence exists, but it doesn't have to be a ton. And an important thing here is that even if the city or other opponents of a project have substantial evidence that would allow someone to conclude the opposite, so even if there's substantial evidence that would allow some people to conclude that a project is not consistent with objective standards, if there is also substantial evidence that would allow a reasonable person to conclude that it's consistent, then the project is automatically deemed consistent. It has to be consistent. That's really important. Let's see, what else here? Standards, including... the standards, they come from the general plan, zoning, map act, or subdivision requirements in the Muni Code, and then city findings to reject a project, or to find that a project is not consistent with objective standards have to be based on a preponderance of the evidence, and not merely substantial evidence. And preponderance of the evidence means that it's like 50% or greater. So something is more likely true than not. All right, next slide, please.
I have a quick question, Connor.
Yeah.
You mentioned the MAP Act, and I saw the MAP Act noted in the last slide. Could you give us a quick synopsis of what the MAP Act is and how it applies?
Yeah, the MAP Act, the Subdivision MAP Act, it's a state law that just talks about different requirements for subdividing land. So let's say I have 50 acres and I want to subdivide it to make it into 10 different lots, and I'm going to build houses on them. And then however many years later, someone else wants to further subdivide the land. The Subdivision Map Act just talks about how that's done. And then the Subdivision Map Act, also, a lot of times the way that the Subdivision Map Act works, it's kind of like the building code, in that the Subdivision Map Act will say, here's how subdivisions work. A city should adopt ordinances that are part of its municipal code that regulate subdivisions, and they have to be at least XYZ. And oftentimes the cities just adopt exactly what's in the state law. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. let's go to the next slide. Oh yeah, great. All right, there are limitations on the HAA. CEQA still applies. So, and courts have specifically said that the HAA does not supersede CEQA. If the HAA says that a city can't, deny a project based on inconsistency with objective standards, the city could still potentially deny the project if there were, significant impacts that an EIR revealed, and so that's there. The Coastal Act applies. The HA doesn't supersede the Coastal Act, and the housing development still has to comply with the local coastal program if there is one. Really, this is just in the coastal zone. And then the city can still impose conditions of approval. This is kind of a nuanced topic. I don't want to get into it kind of in this general overview. And on a more project specific basis, I think if there were questions that the Planning Commission had about like what conditions of approval could we apply or couldn't we apply, we can chat more about that on a project by project basis.
Connor, I have a question about this slide.
Yeah.
If there is a CEQA report that says, okay, these are, high impact items and these are the mitigating measures, can the developer say, those mitigation measures would deem my project like, like I wouldn't be able to sell these units if I apply these mitigation measures. Would they then be able to kind of forego that CEQA, like the one condition or, whatever part of it that they're arguing against?
So I think that there's like some, again, nuance here. I think that if a court found, okay, the city is really trying to impose this mitigation measure as a condition. Really what they're trying to do is impose a condition of approval, and they're calling it a mitigation measure and they're pretending that it's related to CEQA, but really it's not. And it's not a condition of approval that would be allowed here. I think that the court would have a problem with that. If the court reviewed the EIR and said, okay, this really is an impact. The EIR, there's all this evidence that shows that this is a certain impact. There's all this evidence that shows that, these are the various mitigation measures that were considered in order to mitigate that impact. And this is what, the city will require as a mitigation measure in order to adopt the EIR and or a statement of overriding considerations, that would be fine. Does that answer the question?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, great. All right, next slide, please. All right, last kind of big meaty part of this presentation before we get into some quicker stuff. The Housing Crisis Act, you've probably heard of it as called SB 330. Its purpose is to address the statewide housing crisis. SB 330 was initially passed in 2019 and then amended by SB 8 in 2021. So a lot of times when, we just call it SB 330, but some of the provisions that we kind of commonly refer to as SB 330 are actually SB 8. The language included in that was, California has a housing supply and affordability crisis of historic proportions. The consequences of failing to effectively and aggressively confront this crisis are hurting millions of Californians, robbing future generations of a chance to call California home, stifling economic opportunities for workers and businesses, worsening poverty and homelessness, and undermining the state's environmental and climate objectives. So the point is, there is a housing crisis, and the state felt that cities and counties on their own were not doing enough to address this issue, sort of a tragedy of the commons type problem. And so the state stepped in and said, okay, we're going to take control away from some cities because they simply aren't approving enough housing. And we're going to say that, housing has to be approved or conditioned, made easier to develop in certain conditions. That's the point of the Housing Crisis Act. The other thing about the Housing Crisis Act, there aren't a ton of provisions of the Housing Crisis Act that are actually their own new law. A lot of what it did was make modifications and additions to existing laws. So, the HAA, which I discussed before, was initially passed in 1982. SB 330 included a lot of amendments to the HAA. There were also amendments to other provisions of kind of general planning and zoning law, the Permit Streamlining Act, and other development-related laws that already existed. All right, next slide, please. So the SB 330 created, one of the new things it created was a preliminary application and preliminary application process, through which a developer submits a really, really basic, it doesn't include that much information. There are 17 items that are specified by the law that are required in a preliminary application, and a city can't ask for anything else other than those things. And the developer submits their preliminary application, and they say, I'm proposing generally like this, and in this location, and it's going to be, this many units probably, and maybe it'll look like this, but maybe I don't know, maybe I'll change it. And when they submit that application, if it is complete, then the development standards and laws that existed on the date of the submission of the preliminary development application apply to the project for the rest of the pendency of that project. So the point of the purpose of this law was that sometimes sometimes a developer would submit a development application, and they would say, I want to develop this project, and my proposed project complies with the development standards that exist today. And then a city would say, oh my God, we hate this project so much. Instead of going through some rigmarole of trying to come up with reasons to reject it, let's just change the zoning code so that before we end up actually processing this application, by the time we get to the actual meeting where we would make a determination about are we going to approve it or are we going to disapprove it, the law would be different and the underlying zoning would be different. And we could just say, oh, sorry, you don't comply with the zoning and we're going to reject your application. Having the development standards in place on the day that the preliminary application is submitted prevents that from happening. So, a city couldn't, in response to a preliminary development application, go and change all of its laws to make it so that this development couldn't go forward. So within 180 days of the submission of the preliminary application, the development application has to be submitted. There's a bullet point missing on here. It's step 1, preliminary development application, then 180 days, then the full development application is submitted, and then bullet point 2 comes. So then the city has to review the full development application and issue a completeness determination within 30 days. If the application is incomplete, then the city issues an incompleteness letter and the applicant has 90 days to resubmit. And it's kind of a back and forth. This is kind of a loop in this. You can, resubmit and it's incomplete, and then you have 90 more days. And then if you resubmit it again and it's still incomplete, you get 90 more days. And anyways, you can keep going on until the application is deemed complete, at which point the city does consistency review. So completeness review is just for, here are all the items that are required. Did you submit them all? If yes, you submitted them all, then consistency review is your proposed development application consistent with the requirements? So your application could be complete in that, yeah, I provided a floor plan and I provided a proposed elevation, but it's not consistent because my proposal is to build 60 feet when the maximum height is 50, and I don't meet the setback requirements. It's 30 days if it's 100, for consistency review, it's 30 days if 150 units or less, and it's 60 days if more than 150 units. And then part of SB 330 also says that the city can't hold more than 5 hearings for housing development projects that comply with objective standards. So, and that includes appeals, and that includes, a part of the reason that the design review board was dissolved was because if the city required projects to go to the design review board and then the planning commission and then the city council, that's already 3 meetings. And if the planning commission wanted to have, some more, or if there were an appeal, it eats into that. So anyways, that's kind of just for background of why that happened. Next slide, please.
Can I ask you a question
Yeah.
about the hearings? How is a hearing, like at a high level, how is a hearing defined? Like, for instance, is a progress update about a project to the planning commission from the city considered a hearing?
If the project is discussed as an agenda item at a publicly noticed hearing, then it's a hearing.
So would a progress update on the agenda be considered a hearing then?
Yeah, I mean, if the planning commission said, we need you to come to this hearing and tell us what's going on, that would be a hearing. So, I guess the recommendation there is don't do that.
Yeah, right. But no, I'm not asking it. My scenario is, I know we're not supposed to go into hypothetical scenarios, but there is a regular agenda item, like a director's report or like like progress on major projects. That doesn't necessarily name the projects. I'm just curious. I don't want to try to, find a loophole or anything, but how do we actually monitor the progress of these, what could be really large projects if we can only have 5 hearings and they go on for like years?
Yeah, why don't we, I think it would be helpful to actually have specific examples for this question, just so that we can go through various fact patterns, but I don't want to get into that now.
Mhm.
And maybe Margaret, you and I maybe can discuss this in our meeting on Thursday and just kind of figure out what sorts of progress reports get reported versus what's actually a hearing.
Absolutely. Through the chair. One way you can find out where your favorite major project is in the entitlement review process is to reach out to myself or the director. We're happy to respond. We try to answer everyone's emails, but I promise we look for yours. So if you have a question, we're very happy to respond. We're also very happy to go out for lunch or grab a cup of coffee and talk about projects and give you a status report. That would all be far away from the 5 hearing rule.
When you two talk about it, is there a distinction between whether or not the developer is present? Right, so if the
I will
developer
ask
is
that.
not present, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that Mike picked that up, but is there a distinction when we talk about it on our weekly? We do talk to Connor on a weekly basis, by the way. Would it make a distinction if the development team was present? Is the question the chair is adding into that bucket of questions on that topic. And I think what I'm really hearing is in a director's report, which is part of our standard agenda, can the commission ask about certain projects that I bet they're being asked when they're just trying to go buy milk or eggs or something like that. So that's I think the question we can begin to dig into on Thursday.
Right.
Yeah,
Great.
and I have a question about this slide as well. So if there is a SB 330 application and the application is deemed complete and then is deemed consistent, why are there hearings? Because everything is objective, right? So I think that the reason I ask it is because it looks like to the public that we're approving or not approving a project. So I guess what is the purpose of hearings for cities if a ZA has already deemed it consistent, like that level of review?
Yeah, so, this really has to do with the way that the municipal code is written. So, the Housing Accountability Act, okay, there are certain laws like SB 35 and SB 8 and some ADU laws that specifically say that processing of certain housing development projects must be processed and approved ministerially, meaning that they don't go to the planning commission, that the city doesn't have discretion to deny the project if it meets the applicable standards. It is that the even if the municipal code says that normally this project would go to the planning commission, the project no longer goes to the planning commission. I'm not reviewing those types of laws today because you're not going to see those because you're the planning commission, and those types of laws take those types of projects outside of the purview of the planning commission's review. The HAA and SB 330 don't automatically make projects ministerial. So they limit a city's ability to impose conditions. They limit a city's ability to deny the projects, but the review is still discretionary if the municipal code calls for discretionary review. So the reason that these projects come to the planning commission, even if there is a consistency determination, is that the project might come to the planning commission and the staff say this application was complete. We believe that the project is consistent with the applicable development standards, but and I'm not going to get into this today, but I think this is sort of a case-by-case basis type question. The city may still be able to impose certain conditions of approval, or may want to have FaceTime with the developer to ask like, well, I understand that it's consistent with the project, in this way, but the city would really love if you did it this way. And then maybe the developer says, yeah, actually, I don't really care. That's fine. I'll do that. And that is all stuff that could happen at a planning commission meeting. So anyways, I think that the answer to your question is that for the HAA and for SB 330, the state law doesn't say that those acts make certain housing development projects ministerial projects. And so if the zoning code still calls for the planning commission to review those projects, then the planning commission has to review those projects.
Connor, if I may, I could
I'll
add
end there.
just a couple thoughts onto that too. It's in the staff reports for those projects. We will always, for your benefit, for the community's benefit, explain what's within the purview of the planning commission to discuss that evening and what is not, what has been removed from purview by the state laws that Connor is discussing with us this evening. One thing that jumps to mind is it might have a use permit attached to it, right? It might have something that the development standards might be completely cut and dry, but there may be a use that's conditionally permitted, and that would bring it to the planning commission if it felt like that was any amount of controversy attached to that project. The director does have some discretion on that, but that's the most common reason why you would see it. And to Connor's point, there may still be limited but very important discretion that the staff report would identify. And that would be hopefully where the role of the staff report is to lay it out in a land use context, but it's also to explain to the community what you actually can and cannot do. I really feel very strongly that it should be very transparent so that anyone reading the staff report would understand what your purview is that evening.
I have a
you.
quick,
Yeah, I'll go.
oh, sorry. A quick question. Let's say we, hypothetically, we've gone through 5 meetings and finally the plant or the city council makes a determination on the project. But we've gone through 5 meetings. So does that mean then that the developer and our community cannot file an appeal, or what happens if we've gone through 5 meetings?
So if the 5 meetings have been met, it just goes to court, basically. So like, let's say you've gotten to 5 meetings and at the 5th meeting, the city denies the project, they reject the project. Normally the Muni Code would say, if you want to appeal this, you have to appeal it within the city. You have to appeal from the planning commission to the city council. But if at the planning commission level, you've already met the 5 hearings, instead of the developer appealing to the city council, the developer would just go straight to court and say, you denied my project and you shouldn't have denied my project. Conversely, on the other hand, if a project is approved and someone wants to challenge it, I guess they can appeal the approval from the planning commission to the city council. But again, if the 5 meetings were met and it was approved at the planning commission, then a opponent of the project would have to appeal. They couldn't appeal within the city. They would have to sue and appeal in court.
Thank you.
And just for the sake of clarification, when you say appeal in court, would that be like a civil suit?
Yeah, yes, it is. It's a land use and zoning suit. It's yeah.
Thank you.
It's what would happen if normally, if there weren't this 5 hearing limit, normally the way it would work is you would just do however many hearings at whatever lower body, then you would go to the planning commission, then you would go to the city council, and then once the city council makes the decision, someone can bring it to court. But the 5 limit hearing rule basically says if you don't make it to the city, if you don't make it to the highest level in those 5 hearings, that decision is final, and then the next thing is to go to court.
Thank you.
Yep. All right, next slide, please. Okay, another feature of the Housing Crisis Act is a no net loss rule for protected units. It basically means that if a developer is going to demolish a structure that has protected units in it, then they have to, and they're going to build new housing there, they have to provide at least the same number of protected units as were demolished. So a protected unit means there's 4 different things. It's either a unit that was subject to a deed restriction for affordable housing within the last 5 years. To be clear, not the deed restriction was recorded in the last 5 years. It's that the unit within the last 5 years has been subject to a restriction. So the restriction might have expired 3 years ago, but it would still be considered a protected unit if within the past 5 years there was a deed restriction on it. Also, protected unit is also a unit that's subject to any form of local rent control within the last 5 years, a unit that is actually occupied by low or very low income households within the last 5 years, even if there was no deed restriction or rent control. And then also a unit that was withdrawn from the market under the Ellis Act in the last 10 years. And the city cannot approve a housing development project that will demolish protected units without replacing those protected units. All right, next slide, please.
Sorry, quick question. I know I have a lot of questions here, but
Yeah.
For the bullet point that says occupied by low or very low income households within the past 5 years,
Mhm.
how does the city typically determine that?
Yeah, it's generally in the developer's interest to figure that out, because if the developer doesn't figure that out, then the city can assume, like based on certain demographics of the area, that low income households did occupy the unit.
Mhm.
And then it's up to the applicant to show that they actually didn't.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, the next slide kind of gets into another topic. How are we doing on time here? I know that I was planning on having this be 20 minutes and it's much longer than that, which is, I'm okay with that. But if people are kind of wearing out, I can skip through the...
We started a bit late, and there's been, I think, a really robust series of clarifying appropriate questions. Commission, are you comfortable for another, what do you think, on another 10 minutes?
Yeah, I can kind of go through this stuff fast. I got through the meat of what I really wanted to present tonight is we're done with it. The rest of the stuff is kind of just like fun little cherries on top.
Which means Connor is well selected for his career. Just
Should we have Connor sprinkle his cherries?
I think 10 minutes is.
Let's take 10 minutes.
Great. Okay.
Connor.
Okay. Let's do 10 more minutes and then
Thank
we'll
you.
be done. I promise. I don't want to take your whole night. All right. So let's just chat quickly about utilizing commercially zoned land for residential development. Next slide, please. There are 2 laws, bills that are particularly relevant to this. One of them is AB 2011 and one of them is SB 6. AB 2011 is called the Affordable Housing and High Road Jobs Act. SB 6 is the Middle Class Housing Act, AB 2011 creates a ministerial streamlined approval process for two types of projects. It's 100% affordable housing projects in commercial zones and mixed income housing projects along commercial corridors. Again, you're not going to see these projects because they're ministerial. So they're not going to come to the Planning Commission. But it's, if you catch wind of like, oh, this project, and then you're like, oh my God, why didn't I review that? The answer is because it's ministerial, so it doesn't go to the Planning Commission. In addition, AB 2011 exempts qualifying projects from CEQA, which is pretty big, because whereas the HAA says that CEQA doesn't or that the HAA doesn't override CEQA, AB 2011 does override CEQA. They're just exempt. Basically, the local government has to identify any inconsistencies in order to reject the project, and they have to approve it within 90 days for less than 150 homes or within 180 days for greater than 150 homes. And then SB 6 establishes housing as an allowable use on any parcel zoned for office or retail uses. There's no new ministerial approval process, so it's this could come to the Planning Commission. The projects can be combined with the HAA. They could also be combined with other sort of ministerial laws like SB 35, even if they don't comply with the underlying zoning. And then the adoption of a local ordinance implementing SB 6 is exempt from CEQA. So basically this just says, I don't know if you've ever heard of cumulative zoning. It's again, like when we're talking zoning law, it's like a really old form of zoning. Most places haven't done it since the 20s when zoning was invented. But cumulative zoning is like this tiered system where at the lowest rung is like industrial uses. And then higher than that is like commercial uses. And let's say higher than that is residential. And anything lower in the pyramid can do anything above it in the pyramid. So if a site were zoned industrial uses and commercial uses and residential uses would be allowed there. And then in commercial zones, it's just commercial and residential. And then in residential zones, it's just residential. The SB 6 is in a way a throwback to cumulative zoning, and that it basically just says if a site is zoned for office or retail uses, even if the local zoning code doesn't allow for residential uses to be developed there, residential uses actually can be developed there. All right, next slide, please. So
wait 1 second, Connor. So I just to maybe I'm well suited for my career too. You can imagine in a city like San Rafael, where we have zoning that has offices as the allowed use, or along the freeway where we have commercial zoning. These particular laws remove the zoning discussion, right? And correct, but you could be, again, I use the example over and over again about you're in Trader Joe's, on a Saturday morning, just trying to get your groceries, and someone's like, hey, did you hear what's going in at the shopping center, any particular shopping center? And it's like, no, that should have come in front of me. It may have used the ministerial AB 2011 process. Again, we will try to update you if a big project is going by because we understand, but the state has a lot of different ideas and tools in their toolkit for how to build housing. And this will be playing out, I think, in the next couple of years in a lot of cities, certainly not. San Rafael is not selectively on its own, but this is you're going to see ripples on how this comes into play. So worth mentioning.
Would these projects then be on the major projects website, even if they are ministerial, just so that people can look at them?
Yeah, that we would do that, and we're in a process right now of updating that. It's a little stale, and some things need to be updated. But yes, that would be there, and they would also likely be in the city manager's office sends out an update that would show up there too. So we have ways to get that information out. But these are just seeing how we haven't had these come into play yet, but it certainly gives you pause to think what is possible. And obviously they're leveraging a 100% affordable housing project. Somebody decided that's worth removing the commercial zoning district, right? So it's just when it's conceptually, it sounds like, oh, that's interesting. But then you start to think about our city and it's like, oh, that's really interesting. So just I'll stop using the time on Connor, but I just thought to point that out.
Could I just waste time for a second? So coincidentally, I did recently see, I forget if it was a condo that's for sale or for rent, in a formerly commercial space right next to Trader Joe's, just like you mentioned. So,
Full circle.
in the
Perfect.
same shopping center, I believe. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that explains it.
Yep.
Great. All right. So there are certain, to qualify, there are affordability requirements for AB 2011, but not for SB6. So to qualify for AB 2011, the project has to provide either 100% lower income rental units or for sale units with a 55 or 45-year deed restriction, or there can be mixed income housing with at least 8% very low income and 5% extremely low income, or 15% lower income rental units, or 30% moderate income, or 15% low. Anyways, the point is there are different ways to qualify. For SB6, there's no affordability requirement. So you have to comply with local inclusionary standards. So San Rafael does have a local inclusionary housing law that says that if you develop over a certain number of units, then a certain percentage of them have to be affordable units. But other than that, complying with the San Rafael law, there aren't any affordability requirements to qualify for SB6. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, for development standards, for AB 2011 to apply, the project has to be located in a zone where office, retail, or parking are principally permitted uses, has to be in a city or in an unincorporated urban area or urban cluster. Urban area and urban cluster are defined, I think, by HUD or maybe by HCD. I think it's HUD. Anyways, they're defined. Not adjacent to a site with more than a third of the site area for industrial uses. I actually forget what TCR and VHF HR, so sorry about that. You have to complete phase 1. I completely forgot what the last 3 bullet points are. Sorry about that. But let's go to the SB6. To qualify, it has to be located in the zone where office, retail, or parking are a principally permitted use. The project site has to be 20 acres or less. Proposed project has to be either 100% residential units or a mixed-use project with at least 50% of the square footage dedicated to residential space. Note that that's slightly different than the HAA definition. So, interestingly, you could qualify to develop a project using SB6 and do a mixed-use development that's 50-50, but you wouldn't qualify for the protections of the HAA because you wouldn't be providing at least 2/3 of the square footage dedicated to residential space. Here, you have to be also in an urbanized area or cluster, not adjacent to a site where more than a third of the square footage is industrial use. And again, I totally forget what Mullins density is. Next slide, please. And then last thing, I'm just going to blaze through this really quickly. Next slide. There's some other housing laws that might come up. AB 2097, I'll do some quick slides on that. It prohibits cities from enforcing minimum parking requirements within a half mile of public transit. AB 2295 allows for educational employee housing on land owned by school districts or a county office of education. So that's for if a school district wanted to develop teacher housing, they could do it on their own land. AB 25, even if it wasn't zoned for, if it was only zoned for schools but not residential, that could still develop housing. AB 2536 imposes limits on connection fees and capacity charges. This is especially relevant sometimes with ADUs. So the city can't say, oh, you're going to develop an ADU in your backyard. And, for a new residence, we require you to pay, this much for water connection and this much for gas connection. It imposes limits on that. And then SB 886 is a CEQA exemption for qualifying university housing development projects. So that's just like for dorms and projects on university property. I'll go next slide a little bit into AB 2097 because it kind of comes up often-ish, including for projects that might come before the Planning Commission. So AB 2097 says that for projects, residential and commercial, located within a half-mile public transit, agencies can't impose a minimum parking requirement. So let's say that normally for a housing development, multifamily housing development, a certain project would be required to provide 1.5 units of parking per dwelling unit. If it's located within half a mile of public transit, the city can't actually impose that parking requirement. So no parking would be required. Next slide, please. There are exceptions. If an agency finds that the inability to impose parking requirements would negatively impact the city's ability to meet its RHNA for low and very low income households or elderly people or people with disabilities, or that existing residential and commercial parking facilities located within half mile of the housing project would be negatively impacted. The actual wording is significant negative impact. It's a pretty new law, so there's not a ton of case law on what that really means. But I'm skeptical about how useful that exception is. The findings have to be made within 30 days of receiving the application, and also the exceptions don't apply if at least 20% of the units are affordable, if it's a housing project, if it's a housing project that contains less than 20 residential units, or if the development is subject to other applicable parking reductions like those that are under the state density bonus law. And next slide. That's the presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all.
That was great.
Does anybody have any residual questions for Connor?
No, not for Connor, but can we get a copy of the PowerPoint?
Yeah. Margaret has a copy. Margaret, you can pass it along. If you could pass it along as a PDF without my presenter notes, that would be good.
Absolutely, yeah. So I will be, there's a number of ways you can revisit this evening. I will send you the PDF version of the PowerPoint to the commission. This is being recorded, as we said in the beginning, so anyone who hears about this and wants to see the PowerPoint with the narrative can watch the video, but I will definitely get the PDF to you.
I have a couple questions. One is, how are in lieu fees? How do they enter into the picture here?
Can you be more specific? There's like in lieu fees for lots of different things. So there's in lieu fees for parkland dedication. There's in lieu fees for, affordable housing provision under the local inclusionary housing requirements. What are you kind of?
Yeah, we have in lieu fees here that can be paid to reduce or avoid the below market rate housing requirement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So can, for instance, can some of the bonuses and concessions and waivers and whatnot be obtained through the use of in lieu fees as opposed to below market rate housing or other offerings?
So you could, for example, for the state, so if you're asking about incentives and concessions, you're talking about the state density bonus law. Mm-hmm. You can qualify for density bonus and for incentives and concessions if you do a land dedication, which is in a way like an in lieu, instead of providing the units on site, you donate land. But there's no in lieu fee that would qualify you for the state density bonus law. So you couldn't just say, I want this density bonus and I'm going to pay for it. Like I'm just going to basically pay you this money.
That's what I'm wondering about.
Yeah, no, you can't.
Okay.
The state density bonus law doesn't work like that.
Okay, good. The next question, I just have two questions here. The next question is just about, I know you mentioned that, rent control and the deed, what's the term? Is a deed
Restriction.
Yeah,
Mhm.
need to be maintained. But just to confirm, there aren't any sort of like new requirements for rent control or deed restrictions, and those sort of that area of law would have to be applied by cities apart from this law that we're talking about. Is that a fair assessment?
For protected units for SB 330, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not. For SB3, for a unit to be a protected unit, it's not like, oh, the city needs to do something. It's like, this has been the case. If the city did something, it could make a unit that wasn't a protected unit into a protected unit. So if the city passed a new rent control law,
right,
and certain units were covered by that law, those units would then, under SB 330, be protected units, whereas they might not have been before.
That answers my question. Yeah, the city would
Yeah.
have to act to basically create or apply a separate law or a separate
Right.
policy. Good.
Right.
Thank you.
There are no more questions. Then Connor, again, thank you very much. That was very helpful. I appreciate your taking your time this evening. I feel both a little emasculated and empowered. So I guess job well done.
Good. And, of course, I think that this information is super helpful to know about generally, so that you're not surprised, like Margaret said, when you're walking around town and you hear about something, or, if a project comes before you and you read a staff report and you're like, wait, what the heck? Like, that's just not my understanding of the law. Why are you saying this? But again, we're here to answer whatever questions you have on any given specific development application. And of course, those questions are going to come up. So, anything, questions you have, always feel free to email Margaret, or, and then, Margaret can email Nira and I, and we can get you answers.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Connor.
Thanks, Connor.
Great. Thanks, everyone. All right. Have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Okay, now we'll move on to the director's report.
There is no director's report this evening.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. Do any of the PC members have any communication they wish to? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I just have a quick communication. So I just wanted to let people know that this didn't happen on city property, but county property. There's a fire, and it was a homeless person was arrested for starting the fire over in Lucas Valley, Marinwood area. Yeah, so just want to note that, just acknowledge that, and I feel like it is another manifestation of the problem of homelessness. So
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Okay, then this meeting is adjourned.
You, everyone.